I'm going to attack this question of what to do when you don't know what to do from a completely different angle, though. And I'm going to bring in art as a potential part of the solution to this question. But before I head towards the art part of this presentation, I first need to make another point that will be useful in the second part of this presentation. And that is that humans are inseparable from the environment around them. And I know this sounds so obvious to you and so logical that you almost forget it. And I notice that people forget it when I look at fields where humans are central to researchers. The first time I encountered a situation where I needed to remind myself of this is when I just started a course program in psychology, and I dived in there with questions about how memory works, what consciousness is, how perception actually functions. And most of what I got from these courses was people pointing at different parts of the brain, saying, well, this is where the memory consolidates, and this is where some sort of symbols are processed into your conscious awareness of them, etc. And it didn't take long. I guess I was a year into this study, and I got so fed up with these answers. And it's like, this is not providing me any answers to questions like, how do I know what was in my fridge that morning when I'm in the supermarket doing my groceries, right? I can't start pointing at my brain and explain how this works. And I was happy to out of dissatisfaction and digging a bit deeper into literature, to find people like Avans Hutchins, that some of you may know. And he wrote this book, which was eye-opening to me. And the title is Cognition in the Wild. And basically, the claim he makes in this book is that we're doing something fundamentally wrong in researching, or psychologists are doing something fundamentally wrong in researching human cognition. And that is, while we want to know how this cognitive phenomenon works, works in the real world, the first thing that we do is we take this person out of that real world context, put them in a laboratory environment, and study the phenomenon there. Usually the phenomenon even is abstracted, right? So for instance, my question of explaining how my memory works while I stand in the supermarket, of course it works because that supermarket context is triggering all kinds of things. It's part of my recollection of these items in my fridge. However, when we study those cases in psychology, what we do is we take that person out of the supermarket, put him or her in a laboratory environment, and ask them to memorize all kinds of lists. And this is more or less the point that Avans Hutchins makes in this book, Cognition in the Wild. He says, what you actually do there is you're studying something completely different, and you're leaving away a big part of the potential explanation of this phenomenon. And Avans Hutchins always refers back to his favorite pastime, which is sailing. He says, when I want to explain the cognitive acts involved in sailing, you cannot get around that the wind in the sail and the pressure on the rudder are part of the cognitive system at work. So you cannot possibly take the sailor out of the boat and in a laboratory environment and expect to still be researching the same thing and come up with the same answers to that question. Well, move forward a bit, and this argument has evolved a bit over time, and it has become a paradigm that people now know as situated cognition. And the formal definition of this situatedness is that the mind is ontologically and functionally intertwined with an environmental, social, and cultural factors. In other words, in more simple words, if you want to know what the mind is and what it does, you cannot just separate it from the environment around it. You have to include this environment in your explanation. Well, I've been sort of looking around at other fields a bit, and I see the same problem occur in other fields that focus on humans, so that the human-centered research. And I would dare to say that this doesn't just go for cognition, this actually goes for all types of human phenomena. In fact, humans are situated beings. You cannot understand anything about the human if you don't include the environment in which this human acts. Well, So after this study in psychology, I moved towards a field of artificial intelligence where I found very exciting models to model this type of cognition. And through that research, I met artists who were working on the same questions as I was researching. So they were interested in memory, in consciousness, and they were even using similar techniques as I was using, machine learning, and all kinds of things that were very familiar to me, but instigating a wider public debate around these matters, which I found fascinating. So I started up a dialogue with these artists, and before I knew it, I found myself in contexts like these a lot, studio spaces, so where artists generally produce their work. And I was thinking, and as I took this new career more and more serious, I also started to question my new environments more and more. And the question that kept popping up with this space is, hey, this looks a lot like that university office of mine. And it became worse when I was finally ready to do my first gallery and museum shows, and I found myself presenting works in spaces like these. And I thought, wait a minute, I know these spaces. They look exactly like laboratory spaces. So what are we actually doing here? Are we not making the same mistake that Hutchins pointed out in psychology, but then in the arts? Are we not stripping away all that context from the work and from the aesthetic that is actually important for this aesthetic to do something? And, well, of course, as a young curator, as it's called in the arts, you sort of stay low a bit and observe a lot and learn a lot. But after 10 years of being a curator, I found that it was time to finally vocalize this critique. And I did in this little pamphlet or a little booklet called Aesthetics in the Wild. And as you can see from the title, I basically just stole Hutchins' argument completely and applied it to the arts. But of course, making that critique that once you remove this art from the world, and also as an artist, you remove yourself from the world in the studio space, you end up with the question, so what's next? How are we supposed to produce these aesthetics in the wild? How are we supposed to work in the wild? And this is something that I'm now addressing as a professor at the same university as where Tony is a professor, and I formed a bit of a research group around. But before I could form this research group, I of course had to split up this research question in sub-questions, and before I could do that, I actually had to go back to my portfolio as a curator, working with different artists, and look at some of the practices that I knew were specifically trying to sort of break these models of studio practice and the white cube. And I started looking back at projects that I did, for instance, with this artist called Michels. He's a Dutch artist, and in many of his works, what he does, he sort of formulates a general interest and a context that he's interested in. In this project, this is the context, Swami Magazine, which is what you call a global scrapyard. This is where a lot of the scraps from our automobile industry, from Europe, Asia, and is it important? No. From Europe, Asia, and America end up. So this is place in Ghana, Africa, where all these scraps are brought to, and an informal economy emerged from these scraps, in which 200,000 mechanics now live from these scraps. So they're fixing, repurposing, collecting, and selling on and selling on. And Michels thought, oh, I'm pretty curious to see how this economy works. And there have been economists studying this informal economy already since it emerged, actually almost 20 years already. But what they do is they take a sort of anthropological perspective. So they take a distance from this informal economy and then start observing and writing down what they see. But Michels says, well, that's not enough for me because there's things in there, happening in there, that we might not see. So what he does in all of his projects is he embeds himself in this context. So what he did in Swami Magazine, in this scrapyard, is he set up a shop just like the other ones. So just like all these 200,000 mechanics have, a little garage where he started reeling and dealing in auto parts, actually without having any clue of what he was actually trying to produce there. But in the end, he produced something there, and he produced something quite significant. He produced a car, and you might not be completely shocked by this in an environment with 200,000 mechanics and all the car scraps in the world coming together, but it was important because this turned out to be the first car that was ever produced in Swami magazine. Now, I want you to realize that the artwork in this case is actually not the car resulting from this process. The artwork are the insights that came from this process that he instigated, from starting up a shop and embedding himself in this context. And one of these insights, for instance, is the answer to the question why there was never a car produced in Swami magazine, although you have all this expertise there and all these materials there. Well, the reason is that the need for value, so the need to make a buck and eat that same night, is so urgent that all you can really do as a mechanic there is work on small parts, resell them, collect a few small parts and resell them as a collection, etc. So this need sort of holds them back from investing in bigger projects, such as a car, but also a motor block, for instance. Repairing a motor block also takes weeks of time at least, which is time that they don't have, right? And these are insights that the economists that have been studying it had not yet come up with. And what is even more important is that in this development process, of course, the local community of Swami magazine, they actually have a platform of economical development. So where they look at their own processes and how to improve things. And they took great interest in this project. And now they're together working on a new model for Swami magazine where people, where the mechanics work together and invest a little bit of their time every day in bigger projects so that they can have bigger releases of value, such as selling a car or selling a motor block. And these releases of value are important because these bigger releases are important because that's what you need to invest in infrastructure, right? These small bucks that they earn every day is not going to lead to irrigation systems, water, toilets, etc. But these bigger projects could, perhaps. So these are insights that instantly sort of change the economy from the inside out, and that is, I think, an important role that artists can play in these contexts. Well, to counter that with a completely different example of aesthetics in the wild, I've been remotely involved. I've co-commissioned this work by an artist duo called Cohen van Balen. It's a project called 75 Watts. And again, there was this sort of vague interest in a phenomenon. And the phenomenon is the physical labor that people that make consumer electronics do in factories where consumer electronics are made. So we all know that these conditions in these factories are not great, right? And an important part in it is these repetitive, strenuous movements that these workers at assembly belts have to make. And what Cohen van Balen did was, once they started looking at this and embedding some and visiting these factories and also trying to become a part of the system, is they traced back the line from these movements back to the consumer and the consumer demands. And who did they find in the middle? Someone very familiar to them, the designer. In the end, who determines that a consumer demand is translated into a product that forces these people to do sometimes miniature movements, repetitive day in, day out, is determined or is co-determined by the designer. So the designer in the middle says, well, if consumers want this, then we need a little button here, which means that the worker in the factory in turn has to do this very small repetitive movement. And what they came up with, I think, is still one of the most clever artistic concepts I've ever heard, is they reversed this power relationship. So they went into one of these factories with a dance choreographer and wrote a choreography for these workers at the assembly belt. A choreography consisting of beautiful and healthy movements that they could also be making, and have this choreography inform the technological artifact. So what they did was they wrote a choreography for all these workers at this assembly belt, so movements that they could be making, and all of these movements contributed to the making of one technological artifact. And at the end of the assembly belt, these guys rolled out. So the choreography basically determined the design of this artifact, and this artifact was then shipped off to Europe and sold to consumers. In this case, maybe not technology consumers, but cultural consumers, because they're sold as artworks. So why I'm giving you this example is because I think it's a very clever artistic concept, but also because something interesting happened in the process working towards this end result. And that was that Cohen van Balen insisted that this choreography and the dance and this movie that you see in the background was actually shot in a factory where consumer electronics were made by people that normally make these consumer electronics. And that is a fundamental difference from sort of mucking this up in their design studio in London, for instance, which would have cost a fraction of the cost that it was to actually get this together in China, and would have made it so much easier. But they insisted that this reversal of this power relation between the consumer and his demands, the designer and the factory worker, happened in the real world. So it happened in the wild. And that's something I go deeper into in that little book I just showed you, actually makes that there's no mistake, that you can hardly make any mistakes in doing so. You completely take up the context in which this condition occurs, rather than representing it in your studio or in your gallery and potentially completely misrepresenting the situation and the dynamics between these people and their environment. So this made me think, a lot of sub-questions came out of this analysis of a few of these practices. But I'm gonna skip all of those. In the end, what this analysis also brought me to do is to look back at art and what it actually is or what it does. And I can now say that I almost fully subscribe to a recent definition of art put out by a philosopher that I have been following for a long time, called Avans. And what he says is these types of practices make art a call to action, a confrontation, an intervention or subversion that challenges us to understand or make sense of something. And that is something radically different from the sort of classic interpretation of art, which is there to passively enjoy, right? To take a little distance from and enjoy. And these types of practices do exactly what Noe says good art does. The one thing that I'm not really happy with in his definition is this last bit, the something, because that's kind of general, isn't it? And what I'm working on now in my research is to make this slightly more specific, because I have a hunch that that something is actually, we can fill it in more concretely, because what most artists are trying to make clear or lay bare is our relationship to our surroundings. And now we're back again with that humans are inseparable from their environment. And I'm also doing some shameless self-promotion here for my contribution to the upcoming COS journal, where I'm also developing this argument in a little bit more detail. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, because in globalized times that we live in, we apparently need artists to show us how we're situated in the world. For one, because we have relationships to these people in factory, but they're not really clear to us. We don't know what the power relation between us and these factory workers is. And works like these make them clearer to us. For instance, by pointing out the role of designers in there, that there is a distributed responsibility in this production chain. Same goes for our relationship to places like this. One of the insights that this project brought about is that there's not just the dumping of car scraps in this global scrapyard. There's also, because such a big economy depends on it, there's also an enormous pool there. I'm not saying that makes this practice ethical. No, I completely do not subscribe to that. But it is a more nuanced version of our relationship to the people that live in this scrapyard. You can't just say it's dumped there and that's our responsibility. No, there's actually a push and pull factor there that we need to take into account if we want to understand how the consumer relates to the end of the value chain. Now, both of these examples have a relation to production and value chains, but I'm thinking, and this is an argument I'm developing right now, I think that also these big abstract global problems, such as climate change, I think we're suffering the same problems there, because we all know about climate change. We more or less know which factors are related to it and how we might contribute to it, but none of us know how we individually and our individual actions relate to these bigger global problems. And again, I think we need art to show us how we actually relate to these bigger global problems. And this is a problem in the now, but I also foresee a big urgency for artists to address this problem. Because as our environment becomes more technological, we also allow technology to sort of take more decisions out of our hands, which means that we even become less aware of how we relate to our environment. We don't know anymore what actions led to which consequences, because it's all mediated through technology. So I do not believe in this dream of the smart city that makes it all happen for us, because I think in the end what we'll lose is knowing ourselves as humans. Because to be a human and to understand what you are and how you work and why you do what you do, and to be a moral human, you have to understand your relation to your surroundings. If you take that away, for instance, by letting technology obfuscate it or make decisions for you, you end up not knowing who you are. And that's why I think we need art and artists to help us unravel our human situatedness. Thank you.